I'm still in here. Is our live stream going yet? Let me check with them. 1 second. Okay, awesome. Thanks, everyone. So our live stream has started. So without further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister to begin the debate.
Great. So I just want to check whether I'm clear and audible.
Yep.
Perfect. My POI presence is through chat. I'd like one from CEO. Perfect. Starting the speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, let's be clear about where this debate happens. This debate happens when there's a clear trade-off between like taking short-term loss to like probably create long-term profit, which means that in status quo on both sides, if like probably moving to like newer markets is like will probably lead to like short-term profit as well. That's not part of this debate. This debate is one of like a clear dichotomy. Let's talk about what this specifically looks like. One, this looks like something called predatory pricing. That is to say, when firms with large swathes of capital can like voluntarily lower down their prices to like probably crowd out local competition to their market. And note that specifically this is not like dependent on the sort of like product that they are making, but just the fact that they can like price down specifically simply because they can take that degree of short-term loss, which means that like a lot of like local firms that could have specifically competed against them get crowded out within this market. Secondly, this looks like them spending a lot of money on things like marketing, so on and so forth, which means that like this looks like broad social media campaigns, etc. Lastly, this looks like them setting up multiple pop-up stores like for a lot of money within like this broad base of like the place where they live in, so on and so forth, right? Second piece of characterization, what firms do this and like what do these specific firms look like? But I want to be very clear about this move right now, right? This move is a punch down, not a punch up, because note that the sort of firms that are likely and that can do this move in status quo, that is to say sacrifice short-term profits for like a long-term market gain, are like ones that can actually take that degree of loss in like status quo, right? Which means that there are 3 sorts of firms that are likely to be able to like do this like move. One, these are just generally firms with huge swathes of capital, right? So for example, like firms owned by like people like Jeff Bezos are like ones with large degrees of like market capital, and that can take this like this degree of short-term loss for like this long-term profit. Secondly, this looks like firms like backed by VCs who make their specific projection based on like the future potential of this company, which means that they are like probably likely to simply have large degrees of funding to back them at the cost of local companies. Lastly, this looks like just like large firms taking out small firms just to like make their market consolidation win that place stronger. And like the one case that I want to point you towards is like, for example, firms like firms like Uber, who simply crowd out large bunch of like local taxi drivers, so on and so forth, win like the third world, which means that like these people are simply left without jobs, right? And like note that the crucial part is that these like smaller and these local companies have no recourse to this simply because they cannot compete with these like really low prices, which means that they will like be shut out of the market, right? My first argument is about why this leads to market monopolization and why this hurts the most vulnerable people in society. My second argument is going to be about how this creates a more speculative nature of like market funding and why that's bad in terms of creating bubbles. First argument, right? In the way in which this leads to market monopolization. But here's like specific case characterization, right? We concede on side opening government that this debate probably does not happen in like first world countries where like most people in status quo have more or less equal capital like state taxes, right? Which means that like, for example, within like states like the US, like I think there's going to be large degree of like VC funding that is going to be available for like people on the ground anyway, which means that we posit that this debate probably does not happen there. The most impactful part of this debate happens in like the smaller developing world, the point at which like most people within the ground do not have equal access to this sort of capital, right? Why is this true? Number one, complex lending systems like VC, so on and so forth, do not exist within these smaller like nations. For example, states like India, right? This is true because there's a large degree of like wealth inequality due to like processes of like just like non-state redistribution, so on and so forth, right? Which means that the degree to which like people simply have access to like this sort of capital is very reduced. Secondly, family values dictate a large part of the way in which these people simply choose to like distribute capital, right? Which means that like the sort of like family groups or like these specific family like tight-knit groups, for example, Parsis within like these countries are groups that probably want to lend capital between like members of their own community, which means that like the most vulnerable people or people who are not part of these specific communities do not have specific access to that sort of capital, and know that like these are large degrees of capital which cannot simply be used by them, right? Secondly, when the secondly, I just want to note that within a lot of these countries, there is a risk-averse culture, right? Which means that like there is a large focus on like things like stability and like you probably getting a job, so on and so forth. And like note that these values are pushed from top down within these families, right? Which means that there is a culture of like not taking risks, which means that the sort of like broad-based support that you need to like probably start a company, so on and so forth, do not simply exist. And this also means that things like VCs do not simply do not function within these countries for a large reason, simply because of this sort of culture within these countries, right? But lastly, wealth is simply concentrated like between the top for two reasons, right? Number one, this is due to like a large chunk of people who probably benefited by simply by things like foreign regimes within these countries and status quo, right? So for example, like white people within South Africa, so on and so on. But secondly, this just looks like a large chunk of this wealth being concentrated among the majorities within these countries, which means that there are broad bases of people who are the minorities who do not have simple access to this capital. What does this strategy specifically lead to? This means that the unique number of people, that is to say the majority who got large degrees of this specific capital, can crowd out any local industry that they choose. So I just want to point you towards like firms like Reliance crowding out local farmers within smaller countries, right? So why is this specifically bad? One, this means that the most vulnerable groups have like decreased social mobility by the fact that they do not have simple capital like that they can use, right, to like start firms, so on and so forth, which means that the degree to which they can like probably equalize within society is reduced. Secondly, there's no market research and there's no market innovation, right? This is because there is less incentive for like members of these groups to start like firms because of the perceived risk that it has, given that these the sort of risk within these smaller countries. But lastly, like the lack of competition is bad, but before that, COPOI.
So absent this, will these companies and smaller firms or farmers get to compete?
Yes, they will, because now you will probably judge the value of a firm based on the product quality rather than like whether they can like simply cut short-term profits. And like that's the metric that we support inside opening government. Lastly, lack of competition, right? Which means that the point at which a few firms can probably monopolize within these countries, this means this leads to like lower state access towards things like schooling and towards things like medical care, simply because prices rise up because there are very few players within these sectors, which means that without this lack of broad-based competition, like fewer people probably benefit from this. My second argument is about the speculative nature of like capital investment, right? And note that this specific argument also applies to the first world also. Note that now, like the point at which firms use a strategy, people view startups as a function of their potential in future rather than the sort of like product quality in the short term. This is bad because it creates speculative bubbles, for example, like WeWork, which means that people are more likely to like shed like or like to not look at the short-term product quality and sacrifice that towards like this vague long-term thing that they could probably get, right? Which means that the possibility of creating bubbles is more, which means that like we believe that this is more likely that people could probably lose their money in the long term simply because of bad speculative like funding of capital. For all these reasons, very proud to propose.
Great, thank you. Now calling upon the leader of the opposition to begin the case for the opposition bench.
Hi, thanks. POI in the chat, please. I will try to take closing, so I'd be very happy if you could prepare one. Beginning in 3, 2, 1. So off the top, I just want to do quite a bit of rebuttal to what we just heard, and I'm going to start with the last thing we heard on speculative bubbles. First, speculative bubbles within the market exist majorly around new products or new tech or like new fields and new markets being created, which is not what we're discussing. What we're discussing is entering a market and creating a large customer base within that market by providing a good product relatively cheaply. So this A is not the typical format of a speculative bubble, and B, it is in the interest of the companies that their products actually be successful because their whole model is on the longevity of their company. If their company falls quickly, then they never start turning a profit to begin with, meaning it is only reasonable that anyone would adopt this business model if it is realistic that that is what they are going to be able to do. So it's just not a relevant argument for this type of business model. Next, I want to talk about this idea that this is people punching down because these are firms that can take a loss. These are people with capital. And I want to respond just like we're given the example of Jeff Bezos has huge capital, so he can do it. Jeff Bezos has huge capital because he did this and then became very successful. He was not Jeff Bezos, the extremely rich person we know today, when he founded Amazon. Amazon made him rich. The point is that this model is actually very broadly accessible, both because of the advent of major VCs, which is described here, and maybe we agree that this isn't happening in every country in the world, but it does mean that it's an accessible model. The types of people founding new businesses to begin with and trying to enter markets or trying to create anything new. Anyone who's creating a tiny business, just this which type of model is being used, it's not accessible to them anyway. But this model is accessible because of major VCs wanting to fund it, because of mass funding and so forth, and also because it has been seen as successful, meaning receiving funding for a business that is going to adopt this model is relatively easy because investors know that it is a model that can work. It has been proven within the market. That's why, so it is not people punching down, it's actually people joining the market. It doesn't have to be a specific individual who has major capital to begin with. The thing is that we are simply fine with centralizing these businesses. We're fine with the fact that these businesses come and take up a huge proportion of the market. And we're going to explain to you why. A, because we don't think that this significantly harms employees or anybody else. B, because we think that this creates an enormous efficiency which services everybody within society. And C, because we think that at the end of the day, the existence of many, many small businesses is not actually a good thing for anyone within society, neither the business owners nor the customers, their potential customers, or the economy of the states that they are in. So first, let's address why we just don't think that these businesses can be so damaging. First of all, they never fully monopolize their markets. They take a large portion, that is their model, but they are unlikely to fully monopolize. Take the example of Amazon, but eBay is still a major player in delivery and online purchasing, and there are many other players in delivery and online purchasing. Most supermarkets also have their own online delivery service. The point is that they are not going to completely overtake the market, both because there is competition between different businesses, both trying to apply this model within that same market, and because there are people who have an anti-response to any business which is major, and so therefore will choose not to take part in it. Anyone who would theoretically, irrationally be on the gov side of this debate. And there are local needs which these companies never meet because they are mass scale, and so they don't actually apply themselves to any specific needs within this market that they can't meet without specifying their services too much and this being inefficient for them. And third, because of the boutique approach. People of wealth background simply enjoy feeling that they have bought something from a specific little boutique and that sort of class status that it comes with, and therefore they will always avoid these sorts of business models. So they are never going to get full monopoly. Second thing is that they are not, one singular company is not monopolizing all markets. And then when we look at employees, and specifically lower level unskilled employees, there is still huge competition for their work because they are can easily switch from market to market because they are unskilled laborers. And all of these different companies adopting this model in different markets are competing amongst themselves for these employees in the same way that everyone is always competing for employees. So the motivations for how to treat employees and the relative competition over employees isn't changing. It is symmetrical to what exists now. And the reasons to try and maximize your profit based on how much you pay employees or how much you do anything, just those incentives are also the same no matter what business model you are using. You still want to maximize your profit at the end of the day. Now, we want to, but what are the huge benefits of these companies? What they do, what they are entering the markets and doing is providing cheaper and services that are desired by customers. And at the end of the day, this maximizes quality of life for everybody, and specifically people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, because these are precisely people who could not access these services so long as they were more expensive. People who could not afford taxis because they came from a lower socioeconomic background and therefore were always taking public transport or feeling very unsafe walking alone at night on the street, and now have access to these drivers through Lyft and Uber, who are competing amongst each other and creating very cheap services in this field. This is an enormous improvement in quality of life. But second, because these companies, sorry, before I continue, I'd love to take closing.
Yeah, this debate is about where there is a trade-off between profit and market share. Please explain then why running at a loss, like Uber, is not the strategy we're talking about here.
We are talking about running at a loss, but running at a loss is temporary. Run at a loss in order to create a hold on the market, and then you begin to be profitable. But you create that hold on the market by providing a good service. And if you stop providing a good service, you will eventually lose it again, especially because it is recognized that you have this hold on the market, and therefore competition for you arises very quickly. This is why, for instance, Uber and Lyft have to continue being competitive relative to each other, because they both know the value in this market and both know that they both need to be supplying good, cheap services to customers. Now, what does this mean? This means that they have to look very carefully at how to make themselves as efficient as possible. This means that this cheapens their own products and the services that they are giving, but it also means that they develop cross-applicable tools because they have the capital to invest in the creation of new tech, which makes their field more efficient. And this can look like, for instance, the fact that Amazon has invested a huge amount in developing drones, which both makes these deliveries more efficient, but also can be cross-applied to delivering medicine to far regions, or can be cross-applied to different fields and to other markets, making those markets also more efficient and giving products more cheaply and more accessibly to all of society at large. And these things we think are so beneficial to everyone at large that you should approach.
Great, thanks. I now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for opening government.
Hi, yeah, just setting up my timer. Stop. Right, starting my speech in Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Jeff Bezos owns $1 million firm today because he had $1 million of funding from his father. He's a white man in a country that is built on the subjugation of minorities, on plunder and disenfranchisement. The only response we got from opening opposition to our structural reasons as to why minorities can't often access these levels of wealth and whites are punched down is that example, and that example still goes against their case. But note, more importantly, they don't engage with the idea. This is not true in many countries like South Africa and India, Hungary, Pakistan, and like a majority of the world that is not America. Look at a map sometime, right? Two things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to give responses to opening opposition specific claims of like what competition is and like where competition is likely to be better. Then I'm going to expand on like why smaller companies have a chance on our side. And then lastly, if I have time, I'll talk about why speculation is really, really bad and like principally against what we want. One, O says that O is out of this debate because they assume that these benefits are long lasting, right? Which is to say that example of Uber giving people public transport is only true or that public transport is only cheaper insofar as that company is like taking that loss, right? Note that this is a short-term strategy, which means that these companies like take a loss, expand, and once the competition is drowned out, they increase their prices to make up for that loss, right? It's not a charity, because if it was a charity, we also support opening oppositions if like billionaires perpetually ran at a loss and gave people like free services. That's not what this debate is about. This debate is about a short-term loss for like long-term profits, which means what then happens in opposition's world is not that they give you free or cheap healthcare, is that they give you cheaper healthcare or cheaper public transport until there is no competition. After that, they raise the prices as much as they want because there is no competition, which means all the accessibility that opposition wants is out of the debate. Secondly, on the idea of like MNCs and funding new markets and developing local supply chains in these poorer countries, right? One, we support that just as well, right? Just when what we support is that when these companies like Amazon come to these like developing world and set up their supply chains and compete for labor, they do it at cost, or they do it at a cost at which they're making profits, right? We don't think they should do it at a loss and undercut like local factories, which means already all those benefits you can co-opt. But why is this likely to happen, and like why can companies still come? Why can we co-opt this? Note that these companies, one, often have certain good products which they can still sell to people even if it's not significantly cheaper, and this is especially true because opening opposition themselves say that, look, like we have really nice products which we want people to be able to access, which means if they charge a fair amount for the product, they'll still be able to make those profits. The reason this our side is then better is because local competition is still able to compete if their product is better, right? Which means, look, the problem we gave to you at SWAS is the fact that often people have really good products and really good ideas, but because they're minorities, they can't like sell you that product. That problem goes away in our world because now it's just battle of the ideas, and I'll get to why that is true later. But in Gov's world, you can have a significantly better product than Amazon. You can have a better like business model than like whatever any company is. But just the fact that they have more wealth means they can crowd you out in your own country, and all the like that means that is bad for you, right? But let's talk about why in our world, smaller companies then have a chance. One, capitalist hegemonized ideas or not. We think that minority individuals can have excellent ideas that can change the world, they can sell to people, right? We think at that point, if they have a really good idea, good product, and they have a fair playing field, they can fight for it. Two, marketing has changed. I think closing operations is going to build more on this. I'm preempting. Larger companies not have access to have historically had access to better marketing strategies, but now that has changed because of the advent of social media. Means individuals can cater to specific niches or individuals using data or and really cheap access to advertising, which means even smaller companies can advertise today. Thirdly, lean manufacturing, additive manufacturing means economies of scale is really not a real thing today. People can manufacture one bottle at the same cost at which they would manufacture 100 bottles. Fourthly, products are often a part of people's identity, which means they're looking for the next big thing to often be quirky. For example, aluminum straws, which means that if your product is reasonable and if there is no competition that can undercut you significantly, then you're likely to sell it. Why does all of this change in ops world, and why does even though all of this exists means that they still consist in ops world, right? Because not even if you're able to use lean manufacturing, better marketing to make your products good, what happens is once that product is good and has a market, it's going to be taken another bigger company can just come and sell the same product in the same idea for significantly cheaper, right? Why is this bad? Beyond what Suhas already said, right? This is bad because it prevents future competition. Because if the metric at the opening half is competition, competition and innovation means that people have to try, right? Which means that people have to see an incentive and take that risk themselves. Which means if I'm quitting my job to start a startup, I shouldn't have to worry about, look, my startup will succeed, but 10 years down the line, another company will just come and undercut my prices and take me out of business because they have larger pools of capital to drain out. Which means I'm never even competing. Innovation therefore stops in the developing world. This is one bad because innovation in general, but it's two specifically bad for developing people and minorities because not innovation often isn't catered to them. Because even if Amazon is good at innovating in general, the kind of innovation it has is largely based on margins, and those margins are likely to cater to privileged white individuals as opposed to specific needs that individuals would have. This is similar to how there is almost limited to no innovation in sanitary products for women, but there's so much innovation over bullshit water bottles, right? And that's the comparative then. Before I talk about speculation, I'll take a POI from CO if they have one. Okay, right, seeing none. Note that speculation exists on a spectrum, which means opening opposition is fair to point out, not now, sorry. Opening opposition is fair to point out that there is some amount of speculation with every new company, but note on their side, the speculation extends for longer, right? Which means you have significantly larger amounts of funding and significantly larger amounts of money being given to a company, even if it shows years of non-profitability, as opposed to say in our world where sure, when it doesn't have a product, you have some amount of speculation, but once the product comes out, you're looking for profits, you're looking for whether this product is selling and benefiting people. So I've already explained why this is better in terms of prevention of bubbles, and they didn't English that and expand on that in a little bit, but note why this is principally wrong, right? Note, capitalism sucks on both sides, but we need to make steps to ensure that capital doesn't always beget capital, at least as much as we can, right? In Gov's world, what sells a product or profitability is generally the quality of the product and the ability of it to improves individuals' life, right? Which means that the only time you churn a profit is when people think that product is worth giving their money for, which means it's likely improving their life. And we think at that point it's fair for people to earn money from it and that company to grow. In ops world, this all changes because the quality of your product or the funding you get is not linked to your ability to turn a profit, but linked to the ability to sell your product as good as it is. Which means, one, this is already not something that is directly helping people and therefore a bad metric to judge products on. But secondly, notice speculative nature is one that is likely to help majority individuals the most. It looks like Jeff Bezos or white individuals getting significantly higher VC funding. It's just women not being able to access the amount of fundings despite probably having a better product, so on and so forth, and that is bad, right? But let's talk about bubbles and why they're bad. So I've already explained the first effect of it, but there are two more sides to it. One is the fact that whenever a bubble breaks down, it's not just an individual company, but everyone who invested in that company or anyone who thought that company would succeed largely loses money. This looks like retirement funds, it looks like mutual funds which normal people have invested in, and they lose their money, and that is bad for them, right? Two, it creates a domino effect which can often create a recession, and this is bad for the most vulnerable people in that society. We're proud to propose.
Great, thank you. I now call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the OO case.
Hi, just confirming that you can hear me. Yes, fantastic. 1, 2, 3. Quick clarification on why exactly how these companies' business plans work.
you start with a really cheap product. You start with a cheap product that is good in order to attract people to come and buy your product, because if you have a shittier product than everyone else, they will not go to your company if you aren't like, because they can get a, I guess, roughly similar, like a slightly more expensive product that'll last them a longer time, or like is better for them. So you have the incentive to also have a solid product and to undercut their prices. The reason this is a good strategy for companies, and the reason this is profitable, is because companies often, and specifically the companies that adopt the strategy, are scalable. What this means is at the moment where they get enough people to buy into their product or to be their consumer base, then they're able to, like, it's the same way, like it gets cheaper when you go to when you go to Costco in the US, because you're able to get a lot of goods for a very cheap price, versus when you go to a local supermarket and you pay very much for a quarter, like the same amount for a quarter of the items, right? When you buy in bulk, when you buy more, and when you're catering, a lot of your where you spend your money kind of like diminishes, because the amount you need in order to have a truck come, the amount that you're able to fill it with, for example, when you're able to fill one truck completely versus not fill it halfway, the amount of money you're expending on this stays the same, but the amount of profit you're able to make from the goods in this truck goes down. That's the analysis. That's how it works. That's how this business product works. So these companies have the incentive to reach the most amount of people in the long term in order to make sure that they are able to, in the long term, maximize the prices. This is also why their price never goes back down, because they know that if other people, that because of this, they have no need for it to go up. But secondly, they know that in the moment which the price does go up, they lose their competitive advantage across anyone else, and there's more likely to be other competitors that are able to undercut them. So therefore, this is very stable pricing, and this is not pricing that changes. Secondly, regarding the developing country thing, I think that firstly, VCs look internationally, especially when this is an accepted strategy in society. You look for people, you know that this is a good strategy, you want to use it because you think that this can give you entry into other markets that you know currently don't have entry in, and to come up with different ideas. So therefore, if you are someone in a developing country and have a good idea of how this VC can penetrate that country and gain a lot of money, either with an established, you can go to an established company like this, and they have an incentive to penetrate your market because they have more people and they're able to make more profit. Or you can go to a VC and pitch your own idea, something that is unique to your market, but is energy scalable. So I think probably this would work really well in India, where there are a lot of people. If you have something that is India specific or China, etc., you're probably able to get Western or American VC companies who are interested in penetrating an untouched market if you have a good idea. Specifically, I think regarding the local business / innovations that come out of these things, firstly, the people who manage these local businesses are likely to be bought out or be hired by the larger company as they get larger, because they know the regional markets. They have these specific connections that are in place to know how to access the goods cheaper, to know who wants what and what the specific market desires are, and how this company is able to penetrate the market further. Secondly, I think insofar as the local businesses are likely to be put out by cheaper countries or exploitative MMCs later in the line, people who aren't necessarily sacrificing the costs for this, but are lowering their sacrificing profit, but they're just doing this by being more exploitative, labor exploitation, etc. I think that probably in the long term they have similar incentives, are likely to come in with roughly similar prices, and are significantly worse. But also just you worry about being replaced anyway. But also if innovation is the thing, then and innovation isn't funded in developing countries for the exact reasons that the PM gave, I really don't understand why we're crowding out innovation or preventing innovation from happening. I think probably what this means is that we get more innovation and more access to people who want to start companies in developing countries. Cool. Yeah, small business owners, I think it's good when they go away. I think small businesses are probably bad for the economy. It's higher prices for the local people because you are unable to scale. Scalability makes price cheaper, but also in order for people to have enough access, you need to have many small business companies, which all rely on having a consistent consumer base. The moment which that consumer base changes for whatever reasons, or the demand for a specific product goes away, that local business crashes anyway. So they're a lot less sustainable, both for the owner and for the people who feed on them. And I think that it is better to be a consistent employee in a different country and be paid a consistent salary that is reliable. Cool. I'll take closing.
When companies are dependent on debt financing to continue their production, for example, Tesla circa 2018, they often do things like rush to create substandard profits in order to make pretty bad debts a success. Surely this is
I just think that specifically for companies that approach it in this specific way and have a long-term incentive to be really good and to attract everyone in the market as quickly as possible, they do not have this incentive on having a substandard product because they need to ensure that A, they get people as quickly as possible, but two, they have people who stay with them in the long term. So they rely on having the consumers not only enter into their company, but continuously use that company or continuously support them. That's their incentive to not have a substandard product. Okay, quickly, I'm going to explain to you what exactly the impacts that the LO brought to you. Firstly, she explained that uniquely, these companies have the incentive to cut costs or figure out where to maximize profit, but in a specific way, because now they are in order to create any types of profit, they aren't able to cut more than the traditional company, but they are losing more. So they have the incentive to figure out how to streamline their company best. They have the specific incentive to figure out how to prioritize this above all other company interests, which is counter to different types of companies who don't have the incentive to develop new technology or new ways of selling money to at all the same extent. He says, what this means, cheaper goods, but also the incentive to create this technology means that firstly, everyone, no matter how privileged you are or how poor you are, has the ability to access new goods that they weren't able to access in the counterfactual. This could look like food, this could look like internet, look like the technological devices you're able to have shipped more cheaply to your country. But also, given that you have the incentive to develop this technology, you think that the company is able to sell this technology to other companies and make a profit off of that, making other goods cheaper and more accessible to people, like the life-saving drones, etc. For all of these reasons, we make the world a much better place for everyone, much more accessible for everyone, regardless who you are, opening opposition.
Great, thanks. I now call upon the member of government to begin the back half of this debate.
Sweet, just checking everyone can hear me. Excellent, POIs in the chat preferably. What opening half misses in this debate is the fact that these business structures do not always succeed, and in fact, in many circumstances that this has been attempted, have precipitously failed. That is to say that Uber has still never, to this date, posted any profit whatsoever, and its market share is starting to dwindle. That is particularly awful, because while OO suggests that speculation is not so much of an issue because investors can trust that a profit will just magically appear at the point where you capture a substantial enough market share, and OG simply suggests that companies will overrun small businesses, and this is something that's abysmal, we tell you that at the point these business structures are fundamentally unsound, and at the point that businesses, once they capture a critical mass of market share, are forced to operate within a confines of a business structure that is structurally unprofitable, they must turn to practices that are extraordinarily predatory. They must turn to practices that are extremely poor for consumers, for the economy at large, and most importantly for the workers that are embroiled in these businesses. Three extensions that come from closing government. Firstly, why this results in extraordinarily poor business practices, why that's bad for employees and consumers. Secondly, why these practices have the potential to ruin economies and are likely to do so in the not too distant future. And thirdly, enunciating points that opening government misses with respect to how monopolies are bad, insofar as I think a lot of opening government's analysis just relies on the line that monopolies are bad without charitably engaging with opening opposition's reasons as to why they might be more efficient than small businesses will be. Firstly, why this results in worse business practices and why that's something that we ought to avoid at all costs, noting that the failure of opening is that they never explain where the profit comes from, outside of asserting that more market share equals more profit, even though they then go on to similarly analyse that stable pricing will probably exist such that these companies are able to keep their advantage in the market. Note that if you only get that advantage in the market by taking on substantial debt or doing things that are unprofitable, and then if you're only able to retain that market share by keeping your prices stable, then something needs to give somewhere along the lines. What then is likely to give? Note then that the fixation, firstly, on lowering prices means that business culture is focused on cost cutting increasingly. We see this is something that is happening in places like Uber, in places like Amazon. What does that result in? Three things primarily. Firstly, absolutely awful conditions for workers. That is to say, a company like Amazon had massive turnover rates because they didn't want to have to give anyone a pension because it was a needless expense that they weren't able to afford, given the masses of debt financing they had on board. Uber was a company that did a similar thing. Secondly, it meant that these companies cyclically underpaid their workers. That was to say they attracted workers in the first place with large advertising. They promised, and in many circumstances, overpaid workers in the early months that they performed work for companies like Uber. But as they become more secured in the gig economy or more secured within those jobs, they start to lower the rates that those employees are actively entitled to under the guise of not being able to pay employees enough because the businesses are reliant on debt financing. And consequently, once employees have become reliant on those entities to the point where they know those employees won't quit, they lower the payment that those employees gain access to, which was something that was extraordinarily predatory and abysmal. But thirdly, at the point where there's a fixation on lowering prices, it meant that at the point where you were able to capture a substantial portion of market share, when you had, say, over 50%, you were probably able to do cost-cutting measures on the products that made you successful to begin with. That was to say, the substantial increase in product quality that OO asserts simply happens potentially goes down, especially if it is true, as OO analyzes, small businesses disappear because consumers now have less choice inherently in the economy. They're probably forced to accept substandard goods. Those are three huge actors then who are in an awful position. Firstly, employees, because their conditions are awful, because they're underpaid, but secondly, consumers as well, because the products are likely to get worse. Second reason this results in worse business practices is because the focus on financing and the debt that they have accrued comes at the opportunity cost of doing things otherwise, or entrepreneurialism that would take a risk, because to engage in that entrepreneurialism to begin with would be to not please shareholders necessarily, who believe that the product was simply to gain market share and subsequently make profit. At the point where that becomes unlikely, it's less likely these companies are going to do things like innovate to make better products to begin with. The third thing to say as to why this led to worse businesses is that when you captured a critical mass on the market, you also had the potential to do things like raise prices, which was also abysmal. And that was something that Amazon had routinely done. Although opening opposition are free to assert that a lot of companies can still compete with Amazon, that is simply not the reality in many countries around the world, particularly in the United States. And while Amazon were able to do things like have cheap prices at the beginning of its run to capture a market share, at the point where it has substantial market share, at the point where it has predatory agreements with suppliers that other companies aren't actually able to attain, that at the point where that market share is secured, they do things like raise the prices because, again, the profit needs to fucking come from somewhere. That was, again, something that was abysmal for consumers. That's the first extension why worse business practices occur. That is something that wins us the debate in and of itself. But secondly, I'll explain why there's a risk that this will ruin economies. 4 reasons for that. First two are ones that I've already given you. Firstly, that these companies try to profit within the unprofitable practices they do. So they do things like cost cutting, which is harmful for workers. And secondly, it means they jack up prices on consumers, and that was bad for consumers. But two other reasons. Firstly, at the point that a company was able to succeed in attaining massive market share, but not necessarily translate that market share into profitability, it meant that often the entirety of a market was reliant on one or two actors to be able to to consumers in the context of Uber, which meant that at the point where those businesses weren't able to post profits, often governments were put in a position where they were forced to make tactical concessions to those companies that other companies simply didn't get the opportunity to have, which was of itself predatory. It was not playing by the rules. It was something that was anti-competitive. But secondarily, at the point where these companies could never post a profit, there was just a risk they would collapse, which was harmful for two reasons. Firstly, mass unemployment probably happened. Imagine if Amazon disappeared, the scale of workers who would be displaced would be fucking awful, but also the financial shocks that would be felt are opening.
Yeah, in your example, Amazon has been accused of exploiting workers to maximize their profit long after they've already become profitable. Why are the incentives for bad behavior not generally applicable to all companies that want to maximize profit? And at the point which you're that big, why are you going to collapse and you're already making profit?
precise reason that the only reason Amazon was able to get away with exploiting its workers, or the only reason that its workers were exploited to begin with, is because there were such pressures that existed on Amazon uniquely that don't exist on other companies. Those pressures being the fact that they were financed massively by debt, meaning they had to cut costs, meaning they had to do things like exploit their workers. That is simply something that the companies which are able to profit from the get-go do not face. That was why Amazon was uniquely bad. Listen to the analysis. Final thing I want to explain why monopolies are bad, because this is something opening government never does. They simply just assert that monopolies are bad for reasons. Firstly, monopolies are pro-cyclical. The failure of one company often results in the destruction of others in like industries. Secondly, there is more market share for these companies, and that results in higher rates of corporate capture and lobbying, which can distort governmental policy, make it favourable to individual companies. Thirdly, it worsens inequality because the concentration of profits went to few rather than being distributed to others. That lowered things like innovation. And finally, it made innovation far less likely to occur. There'd be less product diversity because small businesses were forced out because profitability was a prerequisite for most entrepreneurs to act, particularly in developing countries. For those reasons then, because it fucks over economies, because it fucks over workers, CG clearly takes the debate. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. I now call upon the member of the opposition to begin the case for CO.
Hello, can I be seen and heard? Yeah, I can see myself, so I assume yes. I'll take POIs verbally around the 5th minute. I will repeat once again verbally. It's a lot of mishaps. People end up putting in the chat, and I don't want to seem unresponsive. So please, please, please raise it verbally. I promise I'll take it if it's verbally at the 5th minute. The problem with the debate so far is that all houses do not compare the motion under the frame of a strategy of growth. The reason why this is inherently out of the burden of growth, because the motion specifically states general approach of companies to grow, because the motion assumes that companies will grow regardless, even if you're not doing this predatory pricing strategy or you're not sacrificing short-term profit. You, as a nature of a company who wants to obviously make profit and wants to earn money, will still try to kill other business through other means, because that obviously is how you're going to gain, how you're going to make much more profit. What does it look like? It looks like other ways such as innovation. Apple didn't do short-term sacrifices, but in fact, their products were still expensive when they came out. But their innovation was used to kill other phones like Nokia, which means that the burden that government burden has to defend still falls under there. But second, marketing can also exist, such as Coca-Cola is not operating on a loss, but grows massively against Pepsi thanks to their aggressive marketing. But secondly, even if we talk about it in a global sense, we think that small businesses, their death was already heralded by globalization, such as things like global name recognition or colonial mentality such as the West is best. These are inherent advantages that big corporations would have already had and would have leveraged whether or not they would short-term sacrifice or not. What does this mean for the debate? It means that largely OG already loses out of the debate, because what OG argues in the debate is companies killing other companies are bad, which we can agree is bad, but it will happen regardless anyways due to profit incentives. But secondly, this framing also harms OO, because OO primarily talks about it being good for the consumer. Again, it falls under the same problem because competition will always be the incentive to profit. And because competition will exist regardless no matter the means, consumers will always benefit. So their benefit is not exclusive and less important in this debate. That's why, because of this framing and because of, well, just reading the motion, the question this debate asks us to answer is whether or not taking a short-term risk is the best strategy in growing. So a few rebuttals that just don't fall out with what I just previously said. The case that still is relevant from CG is that economic shocks will happen. Two responses to this. The first response is that they assume that automaticity, that economic shock will happen, when in truth, these companies don't pull out overnight or they don't disappear. I don't go to bed tonight and wake up tomorrow with Amazon disappearing, because obviously there is a whole process of trying to pull out of a country. There's either the selling of assets or the filing of bankruptcy, and you still have to pay your severance check to your employees. So in terms of them losing their job means that they still have other alternatives. But if there is a process towards this whole pulling out and whole bankruptcy, it means there is space for competitors competitors to come in or return, which means to say that your employees are not going to be left for dead, or these employees won't end up dying. But second, if it's true that they did fail due to this strategy, it probably means there was a stronger competitor that already exists, and that's why the strategy failed. This looks like Didi existing in China, which was able to push Uber out. So this means that the harm of massive loss of employment is not true, because Didi is there and is hiring those people to begin with. So quite frankly, we don't think the economic shock is likely to happen, nor is it true in this debate. So on to the first argument. Why is this practice much more effective for the company to grow? Because what do you need for growth? And we think there are two things that are crucially important for growth. One is that you need a sustained competitive advantage, but two, you need the ability to diversify products and improve the quality of existing products. Why is retaining short-term profitability bad for growth? And we think this goes on a scale of whether or not you're a startup or a big company. One, we think the amount of startups in similar industries have increased because of venture capitalism. So if you are to prioritize short-term profitability, meaning not investing in R&D or advertising, then you only have a set number of consumers to begin with. This is bad, because this means that consumers can shift anytime. And even if one of them just shifts, you are not only operating at a loss, but you have no projected future income because you didn't invest in trying to attract a larger target market. But we think the reason why they're likely to shift is because the way the market works now is that businesses are often satirized. The idea of Silicon Valley is that it's easy for people to copy. So the threat of new entrants and substitution makes it controversial. So if a new company comes in, they are still likely to shift towards that new entrant. Second, we think that short-term profitability prohibits expansion and the ability to improve products. Because how do you improve products? Having money to finance either more consumers or getting more investors, to getting market feedback from your new products. But second, we think that short-term profitability prevents the exposure that you are unwilling to invest in things like marketing. Why then, lastly, do we think it's also harmful? On third, why we think it's harmful is because you have no choice. The nature of constant innovation. Because even if Uber did not take the risk in China, because it was easy for it to copy, they would have lost to other competitors in the first place, or other competitors could have caught up. Why is this far more better? Because if you're investing in R&D or you're making these risks to expand your market, one, it guarantees a long-term edge over your competitors. But two, it allows you to diversify your target market, which means to say, even if rich people no longer buy from you, you still have the middle class, you still have the lower class. But third, it allows you to develop a brand relation with the public, which means that it raises switching costs. So when competitors come in, you are much more defended. In conclusion, this strategy was essential and the only strategy for companies to survive and grow in this current market. But before I move on, I'll take the POI.
VR analysis for minorities companies can succeed because they have access to ideas and marketing. We also explained why if large companies succeed because of better product, that is something that we are principally okay with. Explain to us then why you support large companies succeeding at the cost of small companies despite not having any ideas because they can take a larger loss because of larger money.
That's taking too long. One, OG already said it comes at a trade-off. So it means that in order for you to go for this innovation, or you have the choice between retaining your short-term profits or going for innovation. So we think that's where the trade-off happens. You can't have both on your side if you're claiming that we can't have both. So anyways, why are these monopolistic practices, or why are they just beneficial for employees by avoiding short-term growth? Because while OO says it's good, they don't draw a direct benefit. They only go to mitigate by saying that employees can find another job, which is one, it's harmful because they're still unemployed, but two, it assumes that the job market is in a good condition. CEO will prove how there's a guaranteed benefit, avoid of these assumptions. So first, we think what it means is that it could mean that driving down prices, like they said, but it can also mean increasing profit margin, which enables them to hire more people or increases wages for workers because you're competing with other businesses for employees as well. How does this benefit? And I think it benefits three actors. First, employees who are inside their company. It means that they get to keep their jobs longer and they get larger pay. Employees of the competitors. Normally, you would normally subsume your other competitors because obviously, if taxi drivers loses their job due to Uber, Uber has an incentive to hire them because they already have their skills in the first place. So they so they are able to better expand as well. But three, future employees, increased job opportunity and sustainable pay. Why is this benefit likely to sustain and not revert? One, if the benefit disappears, it creates an opportunity for competitors to bounce back or launch competitors. Also, if you come back, if you're proven to be unethical, especially with the rise of liberal media, you are likely to still have competitors and call-outs. But two, it's unnecessary. It's necessary to support their business. If you cut off 50% of your labor, it reduces your operating power. But third, larger companies lead to larger employees lead to larger bargaining power. So it ties back to operating costs because even if they're substitutable, you can't substitute a workforce powering a nation overnight. Because this debate talks about growth, this is the best strategy for growth, and we are very, very proud to oppose.
Great, thanks. I now thank the speaker and call upon the government whip to begin the first set of whip speeches.
just checking that I'm audible. Okay, assuming I can be heard. Sorry, I will just moving a little bit and then I'll get started. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, is it true that bad business practices occur? Secondly, are these bad businesses practices unique to this growth strategy, responding directly to CEO's extension? And then finally, on why we beat OG. Okay, beginning with whether or not these bad business practices occur, this responds primarily to the contentions we hear at OO. OO's main claim in this debate is that bad business practices do not occur because these business practices are competitive, which is to say that these businesses are creating products that people want and that provide utility to people, but which are initially unprofitable. I think this is unclear that this goes to the spirit of the motion, because obviously the motion stipulates that there must be some, expensive profitability. And we would say broadly, for new products that people really want and people are likely to purchase, it seems as though those things would often be profitable in the short term. And both government teams, I think, quite realistically note that the vast majority of this debate occurs where there is some trade-off between short-term profitability, where you make a loss, and long-term market share. When we point this out in a POI, they acknowledge this strategy is largely to make a loss, typically by underpricing, but then suggest that because profits eventually occur, this is not a harm. But note that they don't particularly effectively mechanize how these companies eventually make a profit. They tell us two main things, sorry. The first thing they suggest is that when these companies eventually become large, they get, like economies of scale, which means that this is like a legitimate profit, that it doesn't occur the bad business practices that we talk about. But I think that this is particularly weak because, first of all, obviously there are diseconomies of scale as well. For example, substantial payroll costs or mass storage. Secondly, the only example they provide you is like buying things in bulk, which is clearly not accessible to all businesses. So I think that this is a really unrealistic explanation of why these companies typically make a profit. I think we can look to the real examples of these companies where they do start making a profit for a more plausible explanation, which is that they do predatory pricing, which they, get the super profits that occur when you get a monopoly. Like that's, even theoretically the explanation of how these people make a large profit. Then what they tell us at DLO is that, eventually there is a long-term good, and your incentive as a company is to kind of, have a long-term benefit that consumers can buy into, and not destroy your reputation or whatever. But I think this misunderstands the debate. It's not the case that you necessarily have a long-term good or a long-term excellent product. It is that you have a long-term large market share. So your incentive here is to monopolize, yes, but not necessarily to monopolize on the grounds of having a really good profit. Would say that often the most expedient way to do that is to use debt financing or cutting costs to make pricing particularly low. What then do we tell you on why bad business practices occur? And I want to note here that I think this is asserted and kind of often very situated in specific countries at OG, but we give you 2, I think, broad, generally useful mechanisms as to why bad businesses occur at CG. We tell you 2 things. Firstly, we tell you, and I guess the overarching logic here is that prices must be low, and this has to be maintained in 2 ways. Firstly, you do price cutting via cost cutting, which might have 3 implications. Firstly, we thought that it often meant you had terrible labor practices, which was to say, that you were forced to shrink your labor costs in order to sustain these low prices, which meant that even if, taxi drivers got rehired or whatever, they were likely rehired with worse rates, with less employee security. The second thing that we tell you here is that you're likely to try and circumvent regulations like Uber does in order to keep costs down, in order to reduce regulatory costs. And thirdly, we told you that you often did things like pressure suppliers into lowering their prices to really unsustainable rates like Amazon did. The second mechanism we give you is that price cutting occurs via debt financing. We tell you that this has 3 harms. Firstly, it means that you are likely to prioritize shareholders over actual quality. For example, see the fact that Tesla literally tries to cover up the shitness of its cars, doing things like non-disclosure agreements to people whose cars have faults because they need to retain their place in the market because they are so reliant on debt financing. Secondly, we tell you that they typically dedicate resources into financial markets rather than doing things like innovation because they must maintain their current level of financing. And thirdly, we tell you that this leads to a macro level dependency on propping up these companies because there is a lot of financial capital invested into them. The very lazy response we get from CEO is like, well, empirically, these companies don't necessarily collapse, so it's not true that they fail. But I think this misses the nuance of the material, which is either they do fail, which obviously has disastrous consequences. I think that is a risk of speculation. But even if they don't, the incentive for governments is to intervene in the market to prop them up, or for those companies to do things like fuck over workers in order to maintain their market position. So I think this sort of misunderstands the nature of the material. The claim we are actually making is that the imperative to maintain a profit based on these super unsustainable business practices, is one that is deeply harmful. I don't think that was responded to sufficiently. All right, I'm going to move on to responding directly to CO, but first I'll take a point from Roby.
At the moment where this is a general approach and not a unique approach, VCs and loan givers are more aware and try to insulate against the unique risks when they invest, making your version of company collapse more likely with a regular company that will fail on either side of this debate.
Again, this material is not reliant on these companies collapsing. Obviously, the idea here is if you have a substantial market share, that means that collapses are particularly problematic, but also it means that governments intervene in really bad ways, for instance, through corporate capture, or for instance, through declining labor regulations. Again, don't think this gets to the heart of the material. That's a shame for alone. All right, are these bad business practices unique? Because CO's strategy in this debate is to basically concede that, there is monopolizing behavior. And unlike OO, they don't necessarily claim that monopolizing behavior is actually a good thing, which it obviously isn't. Instead, they suggest that other growth strategies have roughly the same effect. A few responses to this. Firstly, this is obviously at best mitigatory. If it is the case that there are other strategies which are also bad, we would still oppose one of them. So this is unlikely to win CO the debate. Secondly, we would say that this is more monopolistic than other strategies because it is substantially harder to win a whole market through marketing or good products for the simple reason that there is a diversity of consumer interests. Different consumers have different preferences, whereas lower cost through predatory pricing is something which is universally appealing to consumers. What that means then is you are far more likely to get a monopoly. Their own example, Apple, which isn't a monopoly, I think is illustrative here. But thirdly, would say that even if it is the case that the monopoliness of these two strategies or these different strategies is roughly equal, this is a worse strategy for separate unrelated reasons, which was to say you still had more reliance on speculation. This was still unproductive. We would definitely prefer a monopoly that was established on the basis of a really good product rather than one that was fundamentally unproductive and simply relied on undercutting other firms. The second push from CO is to be like, well, this is actually about where more growth occurs. Firstly, it's not an active debate. If this growth leads to bad consequences, as we tell you it does, it is still bad. Secondly, the idea that the current environment requires this kind of growth trajectory is obviously contingent on other firms doing this. So we just oppose it as a whole, and then that's an issue. And thirdly, obviously they themselves give other examples of successful growth using other strategies. So this is a lie. I think in this debate, CG is the only team which effectively deals with what these companies really look like on a macro level. The structural underpinnings of these companies, which were deeply problematic. So proud to affirm.
Great. Thanks. I now call upon the opposition whip to close out this round.
Hello, is this clear? Yes, okay, great. So I'll also take POIs in the chat. I will take one before 6. I will ask for one eventually, so just wait. Hopefully one from opening for, cross-house engagement. All right. I'll start in 3, 2, the fact of the matter is MNCs will always attempt, or even if they don't attempt, they will eventually monopolize specific types of industries because of the fact that globalization exists, their access to markets already exists. They have things like colonial mentality in these developing nations, and things like just having more capital will eventually mean that they can lower down prices eventually without the risk of short-term losses. What does this mean? This debate operates in a timeline. If it's going to happen anyway, we would prefer that it happens, that they lower down their prices right now in a point where they don't have as much much income yet, and they are in a less of a point to be able to negotiate against workers, against consumers, for example. And I would posit that it's significantly better for those people on the ground. The second part of the debate that I think closing government eventually misses is that this debate is a question of which growth strategy is better. So not only do MNCs perform this, but smaller companies that want to become new entrants to specific industries also attempt to do specific types of strategies. So this also should be an evaluation of whether these new entrants are more successful at having short-term profitability than these types of long-term, than the type of trying to get more long-term types of income in general. And we proved to you coming from Ethan that you're significantly more likely to succeed, therefore become a competitor if closing government and opening government is so against monopolies to begin with, when you are prioritizing entering the market first, because you understand that if you don't do that, the simplest change in consumer behaviors already necessitate that you as a new startup will already lose. So I think even to the extent that monopolies are bad, we are better at solving it simply because we understood that newer entrants are more successful with this type of strategy, the same way that a lot of Silicon Valley startups operate under this strategy makes monopoly significantly less harmful to begin with. Let's first go against why we went over closing government. I think they posit to you why a lot of mechanization and vertical extensions for things that opening government already said, like things like higher prices exist because now they are in debt financing, and that's something that they will eventually increase prices, and that's something that's naturally bad. I think opening opposition says they're inevitably going to stay in the same predatory pricing or the lower pricing that they talked about because of the fact that that's how they drove out competitors, and they'll stay that way. But the missing analysis from opening opposition is to talk about where do they get the income, because closing government asked they will need income eventually, so they're going to raise prices again. That is not true. Notice that multinational corporations and a lot of these corporations operate under the operational costs of these kinds of corporations have more fixed costs than variable costs. So that means that the amount of costs that they increase when they're producing more products, even at a lower price, doesn't increase because a lot of their costs go to things like machinery, which are fixed in general. That means even if you sell your products for $5, if you get 75% of the market on your whim and they pay you that $5, even if that $5 is significantly less than your original price, you still get income, which means you have lesser incentive to drive that up again, especially given that absent this model, you are likely to have new kinds of entrants and new kinds of substitutes to enter that market. The second thing that they said is that they're going to cut down on labor. I would posit that cutting down on labor and making labor conditions bad is not indicative of trying to get more market share, because exploitation in H&M and Zara and sweatshops, even if they're not trying to do this strategy, already exists. So at best, closing government's analysis only proves that they increase the extent, but we don't know to which extent they increase it on. But I would posit that we solve that also on our side. Even if that's true, number one, the fact that you are trying to expand and trying to get more market share means you're employing more people. So at least they do get jobs on your model versus the alternative where they don't get jobs, or even if they have jobs in SMEs, that's likely to be unsustainable given the timeline that monopolies will take over regardless. But number two, we posited, coming from Ethan, that was unresponded to by closing government, is that unions are stronger because you are more in number. That means the company can't just fire out everybody in the union, because then they will have to start from scratch and their economies and their companies will essentially fail. So we posited to you, more number of employees are better for unions, because not only is critical mass more, the ability to champion in social media and governments are more, which means that even if this is true, it's likely not to be effective. The last thing that they said is monopolies are bad, and we agreed to that, which is why we are willing to go against it. But to the extent that they talk about suppliers, I think it's untrue. Because notice that they are unlikely to be able to get perverse deals against suppliers, because at the time that they're making deals with suppliers within developing nations, they still have competition on the ground, because predatory pricing doesn't kill companies overnight. So they still have to make into these types of deals. And these deals are likely to be contractual for a few number of years. So I don't understand why it's likely to be predatory. We went over closing government for the simple reason that, number one, I think we proved to you that even if it's true that monopolies will exist, laborers are better off, which is part of a large portion of their argument. But we posited to you that if monopolies were so bad, this is a good strategy for new entrants to take, because it allows for them to be able to tap into these kinds of markets more sustainably and allows for them to be able to compete with these monopolies significantly far better. Before I move on, opening government.
If the motion was this was opposers using steroids to win races, you can't just say, oh, in both sides, someone wins races. Given we gave you such an analysis as to why this specific method of growth is inequitable and is always a punch down, engage with that rather than ignoring it.
Yeah, but we actually proved that monopolies and MNCs are likely to still get majority of the market share eventually, because of the fact that they have more resources, which means that they can do they can make sure that their they do things like machinery or automation, which makes their costs less, which means they're going to put their prices down eventually. So that proves to you that this is something that is going to happen on a timeline. And the fact that it's just naturally happening right now, even if not all companies do this, is proof to you that it's likely to happen. Secondly, let's deal with opening government, because they just said it's bad for SMEs, and that in it of itself is something that we should go against, right? I think they assumed that SMEs can compete against these multinational corporations had this motion not existed, because quality is inevitably better. I don't think that this is logical. Notice that if you are already buying from an SME and you're choosing between buying into an MNC already, you need to be able to factor into quality and price. It's not just always price. If the quality is really, really shitty from Amazon, you're still not going to shift to Amazon. So I think it's already proof that Amazon already has the same type of quality. But even in their own analysis, when they say venture capitalists don't exist, there's such poor wealth already in these kinds of nations, it's proof to you that SMEs are unlikely to compete when they're faced against these multinational corporations. Their arguments are self-defeating, and you should penalize them for that. But even if it's true that SMEs are harmed, we posited to you that it's significantly better if, for example, they close down right now, because at least moving towards things like industries that are untapped or being employees of these MNCs when there's lesser bargaining chip for these MNCs because they aren't operating on a profit, means that they're more likely to give you these types of better conditions at the end of the day. Why do we went over opening opposition? I think opening opposition just simply asserted that these types of benefits, like for example, consumers, are in and of themselves good, without proving why a consumer being unable to buy something from Amazon is in and of itself something that's absolutely harmful. We talked to you about significantly more vulnerable people, like laborers, for example, like SMEs, especially when the majority of the debate is already against monopolies to begin with. We win because we prove to you why we win, even on the question of where monopolies are significantly better off, but we also win because we talked about why the immediate benefits of the timeline shortening is something that is good, because these monopolies are in a significantly less position to negotiate. Thank you.
Great. Thanks everyone for an excellent debate and for agreeing to be live streamed so that others can also learn from this debate as well. I encourage you all to wait in the main room while we adjudicate, and if the live stream could be stopped while we deliberate.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.